Hi, Michael. Hi, Isaac. Thank you very much for joining me on this interview and talking about your exciting research on mapping informal settlements. So the title I chose for the interview is The Ethics of Mapping Slums. It's a bit of a not very politically correct title because slums is often treated like a derogatory term. So you actually prefer the term deprived areas. So could you explain a bit why and how does this concept help?
Who should go first? Isaac? I just fill in.
Sure, I can go start. I can start. So the term deprived area comes to us from our colleague Monica Kufer and the work she does on the integrated mapping systems network, whereby they were looking at the fact that the term slum, as you said yourself, is indeed a very derogatory term referring to specifically households which are impoverished and lacking basic utilities. But this classification, not only being normatively prejudicial, but also in terms of classification, it only confines itself to the single household. So the notion of deprivation for these researchers, I just mentioned, is that deprivation is an entire sort of neighborhood or environmental or social and cultural way of looking at how different households and neighborhoods in a city are impoverished. So opposed to just looking at one single classifier, it's more of a total area classification way of looking at it.
But of course, you still have this interesting contradictions that some of the major NGOs like Slum Dwellers International almost proudly use this term to say who they are and to claim that identity. And also like Isaac already said, so what exactly is a slum and what would be a good equivalent term to it? It's actually quite complicated because if you say informal settlement, it can also be a household of very rich people who just move there without any legal constraints in the area. It would still be an informal settlement. So that is one of the big challenges that we have. If we look here at a global phenomenon, but so many different local variations, how it is perceived, how it is be framed, and especially if you want to get an understanding of the global scale of areas of deprived living, it becomes very complicated because what exactly should fall under this category? What makes it comparable, right?
Yeah, we jump straight into the complexity of the topic, right? So is there like a short definition you could give of what makes an area a deprived area?
It often looks at the morphological, which is to say not only the building structure, but also where exactly the place is, its environmental situatedness, along with economic factors such as proximity to resources or healthcare or job facilities and so on, as well as more cultural ideas of what exactly it means to be impoverished. Because, for instance, if you look at what a typical neighborhood in the low-income countries or low-income cities look like, you have a much more variability between a very rich house next to very different forms of housing, which you would call either poor or middle income or so on. So it's more of just looking at the entire area, and you might see a lot more variability than if you just say, here's a slum, here is not a slum. Because in most cases, it's not such a clear-cut distinction between one or the other. Whereas looking at the whole area, you see this variation a lot better.
Yeah, the term slum makes it seem like it's a binary term, like it's either a slum or not a slum, whereas a deprived area allows for more kind of gradation, like categorizations.
Yeah, and for me, also starting from my Western perspective, it's also about people who have to live without what we take for granted. The basic infrastructures like sewering system, access to clean water, access to healthcare services, access to somebody who takes care of your waste management. So all these kind of things that make our European cities look so nice and pretty, and that is why it's so comfortable to live here. That doesn't exist in a lot of places. And I mean, we are talking about 1 out of 8 people living on this planet who are living in this kind of conditions. So I think it's also always important to keep that in mind. This is not, we are
and the
talking
numbers
about
are increasing, right?
Yeah, exactly. And they're probably too low, right? So that is what one part that's connected to the research that we are doing.
Yeah, that leads exactly to the next question. So you argue that official census data on cities often omit large deprived areas, but we need this precise information because that's the only way these conditions of living can be improved. So why does this happen? Why does this omission happen, and what can remedy it?
I think the leading problem is twofold somewhat. The first is that these places are growing too rapidly for their own good. Being able to make a good census means being able to allocate specific resources to go and find where people are in a specific city. But as urbanization in these low-income countries increases, so does also the fact that the resources for getting the numbers of people to, be properly taken care of is also not going to match up properly. And so because of this, populations are rising too quickly for cities to know who exactly is coming into the city, and therefore the slums grow at a much faster rate than the city can accommodate. So that's just the first case, I think, the fact that they're just growing far too quickly for the city to be able to take care of them. And the second case is a bit more of a negative aspect. Well, negative in the sense of more of a, how do I say this, nefarious perhaps, whereby most cities would not want to take account of where the people are in the slums, either because of planning situations where they want to take care of private stakeholders who want the land which the slums are growing on. Therefore, it's much easier to say, here is some land you can take over, or here's some land which you can build on, even though there are people living there. And so most slum communities end up being evicted, forced out for the sake of these private stakeholders to build stuff there.
Yeah, definitely. Yeah.
And also, nobody might feel responsible for counting the inhabitants of the settlements, because since they are informal, it's always a question like, just because we are in my neighborhood, do we actually are part of what we need to take care of, right? And we also learned about policies completely backfiring, for example, where I think it's an Indian law where municipalities have to provide basic infrastructure in the moment they recognize an area as a slum. And of course, if the municipality itself doesn't have enough budget, then everybody goes like, what slum? We don't see here any slum, right? So there might be very strange incentives of the local authorities not to account for what is there. And let's not forget that also sometimes the inhabitants don't have an interest in being mapped or being counted. So because of the risk of an eviction that is already has been mentioned, so maybe you don't want to know other people, how many people you are and where you live.
Definitely.
Yeah.
And counting and mapping are intimately connected, because you make visible who is counted, who counts. And as you already suggested, this is not such a straightforward thing. It's not exactly like you're representing reality as it is, but you're making decisions that influence how this reality is interpreted or viewed. So you could argue, like, if I may gloss it this way, that maps are in some ways performative. They turn something into truth rather than simply objectively reporting on what is there. And can you give some examples on this?
Sure. I believe that one of the most famous or most talked about in the geographical circles anyway is the fact of the McCurtain projection, for instance. Being able to say, or how do let me rephrase this, our geographical consciousness is almost shaped by this projection, whereby you have the so-called global north looking a lot bigger, looking a lot more vital to the way the world looks in comparison to the so-called global south. And this, of course, has its own sort of knock-on effects of situating specific countries as more powerful or more important to how the world develops. Another example of this is, for instance, the fact of boundaries being drawn up. In a similar case as drawing boundaries of slums, country boundaries are also drawn up to look as if they're objectively there on the earth. But for most people who, let's say, are more of a nomadic culture, nomadic communities, these boundaries make no sense whatsoever. And in most cases, they're drawn up by people who are not there in the country itself, but by external powers. So take these lines which are drawn on pieces of paper, divide up places in the world like pieces of cake, as some illustrations would illustrate of this. For instance, the Berlin Conference of the late 19th century, being one of the conferences which could be described as leading to the way that Africa was carved up in specifically distinct areas.
Yeah, clearly, yeah.
And in my own work, I like to think about maps as not too much concerned about what is there, but what could there be. So it's more about mapping potentials, what you could do there, where you could go, what can be, how the world can be changed, rather than what the world is look like. So that was my way of making sense of all these different layers of different quality of data that is being projected on maps. And I thought, like, wait a minute, actually, this is a very confusing ontology here. But maybe it's not so much about the ontology of what is there, but what people try to do there. or what could be done there, and how they discover potentials in these areas.
So it's more about what maps do than what they represent.
And one of the most one of the more comical examples, of course, is people who follow Google Maps almost to a fault, whereby they end up driving into ditches, driving into lakes, taking the representation of the Google map instead of looking at the actual road that they're on. So again, this statement of truth becomes so much more embodied than just, oh, there's a map there and it's a neutral object, but more like, I trust it so much, I won't even look at the world around me.
This image of people like walking in foreign cities with their phone like this and not even looking around what's around them.
Exactly.
But that is also something I find super fascinating about maps, because they have become everyday objects thanks to smartphones in these areas where we normally walk. And we take them to be very easy to read, intuitively graspable pieces of information. And once you start looking into the process, how these maps have been produced, it becomes everything but intuitive what you are looking at. It's not very hard to understand actually what you are dealing with here.
It's a practice, It's not like to be taken for granted.
No.
Yeah. And now it's increasingly the case that artificial intelligence and machine learning are used as tools to improve our mapping capabilities, whatever improvement may mean. And what are some of the major challenges involved in the use of artificial intelligence and machine learning when mapping deprived areas?
I think we can start with some more technical challenges in this case. The first of which is the notion of scalability, which means that most of the algorithms being used and models being trained to make maps of deprived areas, they're focusing on very small areas of a city. Could be a couple of neighborhood blocks or specific areas which have been well trained, or the data is much more accessible. But this leads to a problem whereby you can only look at one small area. But the ambition of these mapping projects is to map the entire city. This would be much more beneficial for allocating the necessary resources or urban planning initiatives to help a wider array of people. So scalability is the first concern. But linked to this is transferability, whereby it's not enough to only be able to map one city, because the slum problem or deprived area problem, more properly said, is not a single city problem. It's almost a much more global issue that is becoming more and more problematic. And so having algorithms or models which are going to be trained on just multiple cities using the same, let's say, format or the same way of doing things is an attractive ambition, but it's getting harder and harder, not only because of the lack of proper training data, but also because every slum has its own specific characteristics. So having a one-size-fits-all idea of slums, both in terms of classification, just semantically, is as problematic as having a one-size-fits-all algorithm that can map these areas. So the issue of scale and the issue of being able to map across different cultures, across different cities, are very tied together concerns. And as you also mentioned, the notion of improving the mapping project is tied to the idea that machine learning algorithms increase the accuracy of mapping these areas. But this accuracy idea is very, almost like a false goal, because your algorithm can have 85% accuracy of mapping a slum, let's say in Tanzania. But that same algorithm will not have the same accuracy in Kenya or in Uganda or in India, etc., or Brazil. So even though your algorithm might be the best for your small case example, which is quite good, but if you want to have a much more general, much more, let's say, global ability to map areas, then accuracy becomes a bit more of a, not exactly the best metric to be used. So tied to that is uncertainty, because you want to say that, yes, my model is 85% accurate, but this is not so much one-size-fits-all concern, because you might not have that same certainty when it's pushed to another area, let's say. So those, I think, are the first sort of 3 stumbling blocks of the ambition of having a one-size-fits-all mapping scheme with machine learning concerned.
Yeah, so it's extremely context sensitive, right?
Very much so.
Yeah, what I actually liked about the research when I learned about the work mostly of our colleague Monika Kufner, is that she doesn't aim for 100% accuracy. So at least in the beginning, the idea was this is good enough in order to show that the official data are not accurate. So that there are way more areas that should be under consideration than they are on official record. And actually, one of the first tensions that we had to deal with is that if you say, okay, this is a rough estimate. So it's that is actually what machine learning is good for. So quick rule of a thumb estimates. Then it's all good. But since the outcome then produced at that time gave the idea of this nicely drawn boundary about this might be a slum area, or this might be the area we are looking for, completely was confusing. It was very hard to communicate also to policymakers saying, okay, guys, this is just an indication that in the northeast of your town, there is an area that is not on record and that looks to us like it should be. So that was one of the first challenges, also for me, from a very practical point of view, to understand what is machine learning good for when it is used for video analytics and what it is not good for. And this myth of accuracy and this, also a lot of people are striving for accuracy, that can be completely misleading. I strongly agree with Isaac on that point. And maybe, sorry.
Sorry, I interrupted you.
Yeah, and the other main challenge for me is that basically the means of production are mostly located in rich Western countries, while the people on the ground technically might not even be involved in any production of this data. So, and I think that is one of the big challenges that we have here. I mean, even for our own work, I mean, so it's me, white guy, sitting in Enschede, reflecting on the impact of technology on people living in deprived areas somewhere far, far away, which also is kind of an odd situation that we end up in.
Yeah, definitely. There's also a need to self-reflect on us, like our situatedness as researchers, making recommendations to somebody very far away. But this idea of like the difficulty of having clearly demarcated deprived areas brings us back to this topic of the question, what do maps do? And this is a very pragmatic way of using maps to push for civic action, right? To say, okay, this is actually an area that deserves some improvements in living conditions. And that kind of reminds me of Ludwig Wittgenstein's idea of the usefulness of fuzzy boundaries, because you don't always need to have like a clearly demarcated object because the phenomenon itself is not clearly demarcated. So you can't represent it like that. And sometimes just like a really like fuzzy representation is enough to do the job.
Yeah.
I mean, as long as your task is to show that there are more areas that you should be concerned about than they go on record, then you don't need clear-cut boundaries.
It depends what you want to do, right? For this just very basic step, right?
Yeah. We wish we were in a situation where it would count which street exactly is a deprived area, but we are far quite away from it. So
that's something for another day, for a later project, right? But first start with some basics, right? Cool. Yeah. And what are some of the specifically ethical challenges when mapping deprived areas in general? And how does AI complicate the picture?
I think one of the leading ones we just talked about, specifically with regards to the data justice concern, that as Michael mentioned, the fact that most of this research is being done by Western countries or by Western researchers who are not always in very close contact or any actual contacts with the people who they're mapping. Now, this is perhaps difficult because of course, the geographical distance between the people mapping and the people being mapped, as well as the fact that not all the research being done in this area goes out to the people. It remains in research silos. So in this case, it's somewhat like experiments being done by people in a laboratory, which do not always go out into the world until it has some real world applications. But there is, of course, the concern that as researchers do go out to meet the communities, they often end up making promises which do not always end up leading to the data going back to the communities themselves. So the research ends up staying with the researchers. The finalized map products may end up going to certain private institutions, whether it's the World Bank, for instance, or certain governmental municipal authorities, but the communities are often left in the dark. And so the data justice concern is quite important in this case, because as data is quote unquote the new oil, as has been said over the last the last decade or so, this oil is not going out to the people who need it the most in this case. Tied to that is the transparency or lack thereof with regards to how these algorithms need the classifications that they make. Because it's very easy for someone to say, my algorithm has 85% accuracy, therefore you should trust it. But in a research environment, this can be much more easily broken down to, use this kind of training, this modeling, etc., and so on. But for those who may not speak the same language as the researchers, this accuracy idea does not really translate very properly. And if you're going to make any policy decisions based off of this concern for accuracy, then there should be a good way of explaining how you got there, or what potential fuzzy boundaries, as you just mentioned with the Wittgenstein example, that there may be with regards to how these boundaries are drawn up. Because nothing is as objectively, this is where Islam is, this is not where Islam is. So a way of explaining that in the final product of these algorithms or these models is very, very necessary. Yeah.
And I would say, in general, accountability is more complicated once you use machine learning, because that adds another high-tech aspect to it. Often claimed it's completely opaque. I don't really believe in that anymore, but especially if you say we want to have people participate in the decision making on the ground, then you need to acknowledge that the people in deprived areas most likely will not have the highest of educational standards. So that makes participation quite hard. And when machine learning comes into place, it becomes even harder. At the same time, if I look at the Do No Harm project, for example, which I'm doing, where I'm part of now, where we look together with people from 510 Global, so Red Cross Data Science Group, if I may call them like that, where we try to identify weak building structures which are likely to be affected by heavy rain. Then you immediately have a very clear-cut accountability problem, because if you make the wrong predictions and the flood doesn't turn out as simulated and predicted and measured, then you should be able to explain to people why you made a mistake. And I think it's a little bit too easy to say, well, the computer said so, so sorry, guys. That shouldn't have happened, right? So I think on the one hand, machine learning also adds a lot of easiness and convenience to the process, but at the same time also raises quite some question about how much time do I need to invest in order to be accountable and to audit the system that we have. So if I don't go too much over time by giving one example, so in one case studies we came across a village where houses disappeared on the map, because basically the problem of transferability that Isaac already talked about was a well-evaluated, audited algorithm being used, but trained in a different area. And there was one different building style, which was not recognized as a building by the algorithm. So houses disappeared. And if you do flood modeling, if you do try to prioritize households, that is a real problem, right? So even if it's a small number of houses. So for me, being a responsible agency using this kind of technology also means you need to invest some time in order to make sure that you are auditing also for local variations, for example.
Yeah, definitely. I mean, we come to a point when machines are participating in the interpretation of spaces. Mapping is a way of making spaces legible, making them intelligible, interpreting them. And as you also mentioned, Isaac, it's important that actually communities be involved in participating in the interpretation of their own spaces. But as is the case with machine hermeneutics, which is kind of a new concept that came up that you guys are also mentioning in your joint paper, this is not always possible because, as Michael mentioned, sometimes the level of education is not high enough, but there's also not access to this sort of education about artificial intelligence, or like schooling, or even to that technology, very basically. So this brings me, I think that here Miranda Fricker's concept of hermeneutical injustice is very useful, because she says it's a matter of justice that people participate in our collective interpretative endeavors, in a collective making sense about things that pertain to them, and these spaces pertain to them. So what do you think about this? How do machine hermeneutics affect all of this, kind of this notion of hermeneutical justice?
Yeah, I think I like that notion of hermeneutical injustice, because indeed the fact that maps are being used to read the area, make legible these areas in this more governmental sense, is problematic, because if the machines are only doing this from one side, from the side of, let's say, the researchers, or from the side of the government, municipal authorities who want to make some policy decisions, but those who are being read by the machines are not part of the process, then immediately you have a concern where those who are being mapped remain invisible or remain voiceless and the map continually speaks over them. The machines, in this case, also continually speak over them. So being able to account for this is very, very important, or being able to mention this and make this very clear that the objective reality, which the maps are supposedly projecting out there, as Michael mentioned, is not very objectively clear. Because if there is enough bias in the mapping training or in the labeling process of classifying where these areas are, you're going to have a situation where places which do exist don't end up existing in the maps. And in this case, if all you have as a researcher or a government municipal authority is the map which you're presented with, and not going out to the actual place which the map is making a map of, then you end up with a situation where you're not really talking about what's in the world itself. You're only talking about what the machine is presenting to you.
Yeah, definitely. The map is supposed to make communities visible and give them a voice, but it sometimes has this opposite effect of actually silencing them because they don't have the means of participating.
I also really like the idea of machine hermeneutics because it emphasizes that counting, measuring is indeed a hermeneutical activity. It's not always obvious what is a house, what is a household. So that requires interpretation, and that is quite demanding to expect that from a machine. So in a way, it's a good reminder that is maybe a task that is not very suitable for machines in the end. But I mean, also you need to recognize always the boundaries of the machinery. So what you can, for example, we most of the time we work with visual data. So the project that we are related to, and for example, if you have a nicely newly built housing complex where people are reallocated from a deprived area to what's is supposed to be a nice area, but which lacks all kind of basic infrastructure. If you only then base your judgment on the satellite image, it will be like clear area of improvement, clean streets now, nice buildings, looks good. But of course, satellite data doesn't tell you anything about accessibility or operational ability of basic infrastructure. Don't see if there's water running or not, right? So I think it's very important always to keep in mind what machines cannot do.
Yeah, that's really interesting. Thank you. But to jump to a more specific topic, Isaac, you also focused specifically on challenges and opportunities in mapping deprived areas in the context of COVID-19 management. So can you tell us something about the challenges and opportunities involved?
Sure. Perhaps to begin shortly with the opportunities, the main one was that capacity building became very, very important during the pandemic, as is the case in any disaster-related situation. And I'm taking in the paper, I use the definition given to us by UN Habitat on what capacity building is, which is essentially the skill or the capacity of individuals, groups, collectives to have the necessary ability to strengthen their processes or to strengthen their adaptability, given in the face of a disaster or in the face of any emergency situations. And COVID completely took everyone by surprise, of course, but at the same time, in the context of slum communities, because they were already in a marginalized position, the need for understanding where exactly people were, the need for understanding how accessible or inaccessible certain areas are, as Michael also just briefly mentioned, became more and more important. And so this was perhaps the most vital aspect of using geographic information in the context of mapping these communities. And there are many examples of this, whether from the humanitarian OpenStreetMap or other organizations such as the Demographic Data for Development, who are working with a lot of communities and other participatory actors for making sure that those living in these areas were well taken care of, at least as much as possible. There are, of course, some more challenges to this as well, which I shall mention briefly as well, I think. The fact that it is easy to say, yes, be socially distant, yes, stay at home, yes, you can wait for X amount of money to be sent by the government, but in the context of communities in private areas, number one, they were often far too close together to be able to actually self-isolate or to stay away from each other in terms of quarantining. Number two, because they are made up a lot of the informal economy of the cities that they're in, they were drastically impoverished because of the fact of having to stay at home. So we in the West, of course, much easier to say, we can stay at home, we can work from home, we have Zoom, we have Teams, we can do whatever we want in terms of working conditions. But for those who are living in these communities, they don't really have that ease of accessibility. So being able to map these areas makes you understand that it's not just a matter of yes, they followed, or yes, they didn't follow, but why couldn't they follow? And so understanding their more geographical situatedness helps to understand that you cannot dictate these sort of measures and assume everyone will be able to follow them or everyone is going to be able to comply as easily as possible.
Yeah, I mean, definitely people who live in these dense deprived areas and do daily wage work, they can't home office, right?
Exactly.
I think that people sometimes forget, even though it's obvious, right? And in your 2021 paper on this topic, you refer to the example of Indian cities.
Yes.
And you write about how visualizing the virus has led to much anxiety and division of cities into risk zones based on these maps. And this also dissolved the boundaries between the private and the public.
Yeah.
It's sometimes called liquid surveillance. Can you give some examples?
The more, I suppose, startling one, which seems a bit more sci-fi now that I look back into it. But again, I think the COVID time led to a lot of things which were more sci-fi to becoming real. One of the examples is the sort of turn of these control and command centers in India into what could be called sort of war rooms. They were essentially repurposed into these war rooms for the purpose of mapping, monitoring, and nudging, to put it lightly, the Indian citizens into following the isolation, self-quarantine, and other quarantine measures. So this all fell under the umbrella term of COVTech, whereby whether it was CCTV cameras, drones, or Google Maps tracking, facial recognition software, were all being used together to essentially monitor and make sure that people were following the rules, following the orders that they needed to follow. And this is, of course, on the one hand, useful or necessary for maintaining public health, but the problem of function creep here really literally creeps in, whereby the capacity of this infrastructure of surveillance to now monitor an entire country, more and more so because of how repurposed and how much more necessary, given the emergency powers that the municipal authorities had, it becomes much easier, for instance, to be able to track more than to be able to repurpose the use of, let's say, mobile data in one example, whereby people in Delhi, approximately over 25,000 of them, had their private numbers given to the police officers for the purpose of being able to track whether or not people are actually following the COVID quarantine measures, self-isolation measures. So the situation shows that it's very easy for a trade-off to be made between the need for public health and the context of following the sort of rules and regulations, but at the same time, surveillance, which is necessary because we do need to know what is happening in a given day-to-day situation in the city. But at what point does the line between controlling for, let's say, public disasters lead to invasion of the private lives of citizens? And where does who gets to draw that line, and how far does that line get sort of distilled or taken away?
And these are some really dystopian scenarios, right? But in your paper, you also mentioned some positive effects these technologies have had. Maybe you could mention also some of those.
Sure. So they again link back to the notion of capacity building, whereby due to the more expanded ability to surveil the different cities, you have instances of, for instance, in Kerala and Karnataka, 2 cities in India, whereby you are able to now provide better food supplies to the people who were left stranded due to the fact of not being able to work anymore, or you'll be able to understand specific areas that were most in need through the creation of heat maps or hotspots. So while on the one hand, you would think that it is all negative to have this sort of surveillance infrastructure becoming more and more engrossing and embedded into the sort of daily fabric of people's lives, but it can also be repurposed for a positive situation as well. So I don't think it's easy to say that it is completely bad or completely good, but it just does show this duality that exists in this kind of situation.
Yeah, definitely. It takes us back to kind of like the agency behind mapping. What do we use them for? Not just they're not just neutral, right?
Sure.
Yeah. Thank you. Michael, you started working on philosophical issues in mapping via a collaboration with the German federal police on crime mapping and disaster preparedness. Can you tell us a bit more about what you did there and the resulting philosophical insights?
Yeah, okay. That was a bigger project that I was working in when I still was in Tübingen at the International Center for Ethics and Science and Humanities. And this was mostly concerned about how to make sense of subjective and objectified data about feeling secure, being secure, and how to deal with these different levels of claims about security. And as part of that, we looked also into crime mapping. That is really where, for me, for the first time, I realized how complicated maps are. So, for example, the database that we were using at that time was organized in a very particular way. Because if you think about the location or location data that you can map to that you can link to a crime, you actually have quite some options here. So, for example, if I live in Münster now, so if I go to Berlin and somebody robs me and the offender is from Munich, you already have three geographical data involved: Münster, Berlin, and Munich. And at that time, the database that we were using was designed with having prevention in mind. So they wanted to focus on giving information for people who are likely to become a victim. So basically, the leading geodata in the database was Münster. So if you would not take that into account and simply use the geodata and put a dot on the map where whenever you find an entry, you would end up with a map that would give you an idea where the victims of crimes lived in the past. But not where the crime did happen. And that was for me a really eye-opener about the way that data is being linked to visual representations such as maps, and how misleading it can be if you don't understand how they are constructed. And then from there on, it was a rabbit hole. So I was just amazed about how this simple, easy to use, apparently intuitively accessible artifacts hided so many differences in data quality, for example, so that data sets were meshed together for all kind of purposes on one piece that looked very neatly in the end, very accurate. But in the end, you really know that actually this data set is terrible. This one is really good, but we don't see this here. This one is 5 years old. This is 10 years old. This just came in yesterday. And everything is meshed together in one thing. And that was for me one way where I found this is really one kind of technological artifact that is completely underappreciated in philosophy of technology and is often overlooked as a major planning tool that people take for granted. And therefore, like, no, we need to understand the tools that we are planning with, so that it's really worthwhile to spend some time on this. And that's basically how I got into the topic of maps.
These are totally misleading informations that these maps are showing, but there are also some bit more like sinister associations with crime mapping, particularly in the United States. So it evokes predictive policing, and it's entangled with biases and reproduces already existing inequalities. Did you encounter some of these issues in the German federal police and the way the maps were used there?
No, actually, we try to, having these things in mind, so working together with a research unit of the federal police, we could try to come up with some counter mapping strategies where we try to take into account people's life experience as a corrective in this kind of data aggregations. But indeed, mapping, so predictive policing, of course, we often think about the typical US-American case of trying to predict individual behavior. But if you look into the European landscape, actually maps play a major role in predictive policing because it's often spatial based. It's about identifying hot zones, identifying areas where we are more likely to think of a crime to occur. So this also really plays a role then. There's a close connection to the two topics. But again, individual risk-based profiling happens very, very rarely, at least in Europe. But maps play a huge role in saying, okay, this is a likely area for burglary, for example. So that is where it comes into play. But but at the same time, also you see counter mapping movements. So there are also now people working in legal mappings that they show where arrests do happen, and then to show that this is, of course, these are the area where you have historically discriminated minorities, where you have poor people living, and also to show these kind of biases. So I find it very interesting that maps can do both. So they can become instruments of domination, but they can also at times become signals of hope that you can say, wait a minute, if that is the objectivity that you want in the discussion, here we have another map for you that clearly shows that there's a racial bias in policing, right?
Wow, yeah, completely. Yeah, that's super interesting. It's like, as you mentioned in your talk in the last Philosophy of the City conference in Turin, like just visualizing using maps can be positive because people want to count, they want to become visible, they want their voices to be heard. But in some cases, it's detrimental because then you are just because if it's biased and because if it reproduces existing inequalities. So there can be like any other tool, it can be used for any sorts of purposes, and it's not in itself like good or bad, as you mentioned. Yeah.
Still, it's a question of who owns the means of production, right? So, I mean, that is with all the positive negatives that we can offer. This is still, if you look where mapping is happening, who has the technologies, who has access to satellite data, it is a clear picture.
Okay. And to touch upon another one of your projects that is more applied, Michael, you and your colleagues are involved in fieldwork in Malawi, where you're collaborating on the first dedicated humanitarian drone corridor. Can you tell us more about this project?
Yeah, so that is basically the Do No Harm project, where basically it's a collaboration with my colleagues on the Earth Observation Group in Twente, but also with UNICEF Malawi and 510 Global. And yes, we do fieldwork, which is a bit uncommon for philosophers. And I have to say, whenever something goes wrong in the fieldwork, I always say, like, yeah, you know, the good old times when we just wrote books that was so easy, right? But besides all of that, I think there's really a value in discussing with stakeholders, going on the ground, trying to understand what you will not find in the books. So that's something that I learned already in my projects that I did in Germany, where we worked together with groups of different people with disabilities and medical conditions in order to better understand where the challenges lie if you introduce certain security measures. And the same also now applies for this kind of research. Because if you look back into applied ethics, like when I was a student, but it was a long time ago, basically applied ethics meant, let's look at the newspaper, let's grab a headline, and let's show why Kant was right. So, yeah, so
good old time.
And without any reflection on how this news reporting came about, what were the underlying disciplines involved, if there was a discipline involved. It was mostly to illustrate the case that you wanted to make, or to show there's an interesting challenge in this particular one. And I don't know if we do it now correctly. Maybe we are going in the wrong direction. Sometimes I feel like a bad social scientist rather than becoming a better ethicist. But by trying to be more conscious about how we relate to real life cases, how we relate to real life positions and views, I think it's we become more flexible in trying to understand what people really need and what they think and where the challenges are lying. And you don't get that from reading newspapers at times. But of course, it's also a major challenge. So one of my colleagues just organized focus groups in poor rural communities to talk about their opinion about drone data acquisition. So, and we spend a lot of time trying to understand what is the level of data literacy that we can expect, and what are people familiar with. I mean, even when we now talk about it among ourselves, what exactly machine learning is, it's sometimes hard to explain. I don't even would grasp or understand completely all details. So we had meetings also with locals, also working here in Twente, and so we learned that WhatsApp is a commonly used tool in these communities, and that actually was our entry point. We said, okay, if you use WhatsApp and there are discussions about data sharing practices, we can use that as a guiding metaphor to talk about what basically Red Cross is doing. It's and actually it was way more easy than we thought to talk about data sharing and to see what people want, what they what they accept as a good reason, and basically a lot of confirmation about what we were already expecting. They want something back. So as long as the local communities were under the impression that the data is being collected for benevolent purposes that would serve the community, it wasn't seen as a major thing. Huh? But in the moment where somebody would try to make money out of it and they don't get a share, that was a thing. What I really found interesting is that it was a clear opposition to the idea that you just need to talk to the community leaders. The people in the meeting were clearly like, no, we want to be asked. It's not enough to ask our community leader. No. They also have politics, right? So I found that interesting because it's often seen as or presented as a minimum requirement if you cannot get informed consent by all individuals, that you at least talk to community representatives or community leaders. But this discussion clearly showed that once you start talking to individuals, they might disagree and say, no, I may have a different opinion here.
Yeah. Isaac, do you want to add something to that? You also have experience with field work.
Unfortunately, I didn't get to because my project started just at the sort of beginning of the pandemic. So just as we were about to get our plans for, potential fieldwork opportunities and such, well, of course, we couldn't fly anywhere. But one sort of saving grace of that was being able to be in virtual meetings, at least, with some colleagues in South America, where I learned, similar to Michael's situation of the sort of on-the-ground politics. One colleague from South America was telling us how, in Brazil specifically, the mapping situation there is quite funny because you have the involvement in the favelas, which are also slums and formal settlements, but they're called favelas in Brazil. But they also have a different kind of politics whereby there are a lot of gangs present in those areas. And it's a very weird situation of a triangle relationship, you could say, between the communities, the gangs, and the police. So the police want, of course, to capture the gangs. But at the same time, the people in the communities don't trust the police fully because the police often are abusive or are not so much as understanding of the situation there. The mapping project that they wanted to do in one of the particular cities, I cannot remember off the top of my head right now, but one of the cities they wanted to get some mapping done with community members. But they also involved the gangs in the participation of the mapping because obviously the gangs don't want, to be mapped. So because they know that if these maps end up being taken to the police, well, the police will find where the gang members are. So you have a situation where you want to have an open access map to know where people are, but you also have this internal dynamic of certain people like the gangs or other stakeholders do not want to be physically mapped or do not want to be shown where they are. So we often, from a distance, you would say, well, yes, open data is always good. We should always be able to know where everyone is. But as you talk to people who are actually in the community, as in Michael's case in Malawi, or in the context of Brazil, or in other contexts in general, if you want to look more to the nitty-gritty of it all, there are so many dynamics going on that you wouldn't get from simply, let's say, reading a book on, how maps are presented, or reading a book on how technology is always good or always bad. Is this internal dynamics you can only get from interaction with people in the ground, opposed to just making up theories in your head of, oh yes, maps are not objective, maps are objective, and so on, going one way or the other with these arguments. But knowing the actual ground truth or the ground dynamics adds a lot more to how more interactive and dynamic the process of mapping itself is, not just the final product being sort of the focus or the site of argumentation.
That's
maybe
really interesting.
And if you take one step back, so my whole interest in doing a more applicable version of philosophy is rooted in my unease about the practice of black boxing that we have in philosophy. So we hardly ever talk about the practice of doing philosophy and where our inspiration comes from, how we choose our topics. And then, of course, it gets very hard to have a discussion about what do we neglect and what do we highlight and where are our own biases. Because basically, again, going back to my time when I was a student, a philosopher was somebody who did magical things, and then suddenly there was a book.
Like
and nobody, right? But nobody talks about how do we choose our topics. What is the politics of publishing houses? What sells well? Who sets the agenda, and the like. And I think so that makes us a very close system. And that is what I like about this more interdisciplinary, transdisciplinary projects. That, for example, something like looking into the use of machine learning for mapping deprived areas is not something that immediately comes to your mind when you're doing philosophy. But once you get into this field, there are so many interesting aspects where we can contribute to in discussions on intercultural dimension of technology, for example, and the need of having more politics in philosophy of technology in respect to thinking about what are we talking about when we talk about cities and philosophy of the city, because I haven't seen too many presentations on deprived areas, for example, in our own conferences. So that is why I value this more empirical approach by making it a little bit more transparent and being more transparent about how we choose our topics and how we approach them.
Yeah, I think it's a super exciting approach, and it's an example also from my own work that I would like to do. I appreciate this, like, by contrasting to the armchair philosopher. Like, you go into the field and you it's exactly this interaction and relationality that helps you gain insights that you wouldn't have had before, like some more nuanced on the sense of on the level of information, just more nuanced information, but also on the level of understanding, grasping the dynamics that are at play that cannot be like maybe even represented so well otherwise. So I myself would like to work like that too, but I have the same concern as that you, Michael, also mentioned, that we're just kind of maybe second-rate social scientists. But I don't think it's the case. I think there's something more we can contribute as philosophers. But I'm really interested in what you all think. What is, in your experience, what is this something that we can contribute maybe to help these people who live in deprived areas? Or maybe generally people from humanities.
Yeah, I often think more of the people from the humanities, because whenever I introduce my topic to people, they would say, "Oh, wow, you're really helping the people in the slums." And like, I try to put the conversation out there. I try to enter the dialogue, but I'm not going to go as far as to say that I'm completely, let's say, leading to any policy changes there. Because the only thing I feel I can do in my little sort of circle, my little stage, is to make the conversation as significant as possible, that we need to talk about data justice. We need to talk about transparency. We need to talk about the place of bias in the training and also in the actual finalized product. We need to talk about the explainability of these models, because as we're engaging in much more of this sort of transcultural or interdisciplinary way of doing ethics, way of doing philosophy, also of putting technology out there, it needs to be also be nuanced in this case, where these dynamics, which we're often sort of talking about only in ethical circles, geographers have been talking about as well, perhaps not as heavily as we philosophers are, but the conversation is also there. The same thing with computer scientists or data scientists, where privacy is a big buzzword now in terms of big data or AI, but it is often also a buzzword that is not, let's say, translated properly across, because we need to also know, what do people in communities think of privacy? Because for us to say this is what they should think about privacy, but what are they also concerned with in terms of their own stakes, in terms of their own, let's say, understanding of what privacy is. So that dialogue, I think, is getting more and more crucial, opposed to just saying we have solved all the ethical problems, just output it into the sort of papers, and that will lead to more changes. But it's more of a dialogue that needs to be had in what exactly ethics is across the board.
Yeah, that's fascinating. Yeah, really exciting. And you, Michael?
Yeah, for me, I'm always surprised how I don't think of myself often as a philosopher, but then I always have to recognize that I have a philosophical training, and that shines through. So, but I raise questions in interdisciplinary transdisciplinary dialogues that other people seem to find strange, stimulating, or something, where I feel like, yeah, that is a typical question to ask here. So I think that we can bring in our perspectives, our desire for clarity, our knowledge about conceptual frameworks. I think, Isaac, what you just brought up with privacy, for example, is a good case. So somebody throws in something like, we uphold privacy, and the philosopher goes like, what kind of privacy, what kind of justification, exactly what are you building your account on? Have you considered the intercultural impact? So, and I think that is the added value that we bring in, that we are good in problem reframing and framing, and where we can make our good contribution. Indeed, Also, our own impact will be limited, but I think it's also important to recognize that philosophy is not done by one person. I mean, that is maybe also one of the things that is misleading the way that we still teach philosophy or history of philosophy to our students. That is all about these major figures that had this one idea and then change the world. That is not how it works. And I think we can be a little bit more relaxed. So maybe it's also important when with all my energy that I put into making philosophy more empirical, I'm totally fine with armchair philosophers. I think we need them.
Yeah.
What we even need more is a combination of these different kinds of philosophy in order to make philosophy work nowadays. So maybe that helps a little bit for people who are a little bit hesitant and saying, "Oh, is this still philosophy what I'm doing?" Don't worry too much. If you go wrong and you do cultural studies instead, well, hopefully you do good work and philosophy will survive. So it's fine. Don't be too worried.
I think I often make the joke that my case is a bit of being a philosopher is being between a consultant and a lawyer. Because on the one hand, I'm often talking about liability issues of responsibility and accountability. On the other hand, suggesting techno fixes or social fixes to the techno fixes that didn't work out. So I think I'm sort of navigating those two poles sometimes.
Well, that's a challenging role to have. Yeah, but I mean, definitely, like as you say, we're maybe moving away from this idea of like a monolithic genius who, from the power of his pure reason, gives us the answers, and rather it's about the practice of reframing problems, of creating clarity, but not on our own, rather in collaboration and in dialogue with the communities that we are talking about.
I mean, it's maybe also just good to emphasize, also in view of the colleagues that we are collaborating with from remote sensing and like, these people are quite clever, they're really good, and they have a good sensitivity of also the conceptual issues underlying. So also this view that I still find in philosophers that engineers are just concerned about technology, forget about that. So I learned a lot also about where to pay attention to and what the problem really could be in these collaborations.
So we need to burst the bubbles of kind of the superiority of philosophy and just kind of get back to earth and talk to people. Well, thank you so much. It was super fascinating. And I'm looking forward to meeting you in person sometime and doing philosophy together, hopefully.
Yeah, great.
Likewise here.
Okay.
Take care.
Take care.
Thanks a lot.